started recording. Right, let's start. So thank you so much for everyone for joining us. It's an absolute honour to be hosting Sathnam, interviewed by Jamie. Jamie's a good friend of ours, lives in Berkhamsted. I even bought one of his books home from the shop earlier. Here's one of his. I don't know if you can you see that?
Way back.
That's signed copies of Jamie's books, but clearly the most important thing we're talking about here is this one. So I bought one. I trust you've all bought your own copies as well. But thank you so much to Jamie as his cat starts taking center stage.
Unbelievable that he's turned up right now. Come on, down you get.
That's fine. Let it take time. That's fine. Can I just point everyone in the direction of both the chat function and also Q&A? Jamie's kindly offered to manage the Q&A function through the event, and he will take your questions. There was one or two emailed to me, which I've sent to Jamie as well. And also, if you just have a nice comment, just use the chat bit as well. And I'm going to leave you to it. And so thank you both. And I will see you. I'll see you for the last couple of minutes.
Thanks very much, Ben. So as Ben said, we're really fortunate this evening to be joined by author, journalist, documentary filmmaker Sathnam Sanghera to talk about his new book, Empireland, which this week marks week number 4 on the Sunday Times bestseller list. I found this a really remarkable, fascinating book about imperialism, empire, and how both have shaped the country we all live in, unless there's some people calling from overseas. And amidst the raft of brilliant reviews that I was looking at earlier today, one of the things that stood out for me was a quote from John Simpson that said it's a book that should be on the compulsory reading list of every secondary school in the country. So, which I agree with. And welcome, Sathnam.
Thank you for your time, Jamie. Nice to be back in my living room again, where I've been for the last month.
The first thing I wanted to start with was sort of an obvious thing about what led you to writing the book, because as you know, the word urgent is often overused when referring to books. But as I read this, it did feel urgent. I don't know whether it was because of the kind of pace of the writing or the way you give so many examples to illustrate every single point you're making in there. And so it felt like you really had something to say and wanted to say it right now. Had the idea of the book been germinating for a really, really long time and you came to a point that you were ready to write it?
Yeah, it was actually probably 4 years in the making, and 4 years of research anyway. And to be honest, I did a reading last year, probably maybe this time last year, at a friend of mine's literary event, and it kind of died a death. And I think people didn't really understand what I was trying to do. And it was quite an esoteric idea, to be honest, because like most books about empire are about whether it was good or bad and all that kind of business. And also, or they're about how the empires shaped the world. And there's been nothing really on how empire shaped us. And yeah, it's a really esoteric subject. But then Black Lives Matter happened, and it was quite surreal. It's quite surreal because I was towards the end of writing the book, and I remember it being on the news every day. And I remember sitting here with my nieces, and I couldn't believe it. There was an item on the news at 10 talking about how British Empire had created racism, which then had been exported to America. And I was like, what the hell? This is like the stuff I'm writing about. So it was quite surreal. And but yeah, I mean, it was going to be many different things during those 4 years. It was going to be a screenplay at one point. It was going to be a biography of this one guy, Dean Mohammed. Then it was going to be a biography of a couple of people like him. And then it was going to be a novel. But it only took its shape when I did a documentary for Channel 4 on Jallianwala Bagh, a famous massacre. And that's when I realized that the way Sikhs were treated in imperial India echoed the way they were treated in post-war Britain. And that's where I realized I had to write a book about the legacies. Was that a long, convoluted answer to your very simple question?
No, it's exactly the right answer. And it kind of sets up the next thing I was going to ask, which was about that documentary. And so that visit and that experience started to shape the book really then.
Yeah. I mean, it was, the Sikhs have a very interesting relationship with empire in that we didn't fight it, in the sense that, you know, after we lost the Anglo-Sikh wars, we were the last group to really lose to the British. When they defeated us in 2 Anglo-Sikh wars, they finally had the whole of India. But then we took the side of the British during the mutiny of 1857. And we fought in large numbers in both world wars, traveled to East Africa to help build the railways, travel to Britain in quite large numbers too. So we took advantage of empire. So I didn't go into it thinking, oh, I wasn't brought up like hating empire. So I think I came into the subject with probably less anger than some people.
Yeah, I mean, reading the book, I think it's been reflecting one of the questions here, it's incredibly measured and fair-minded at times as well. And there are moments where you try and find balance, and you address some of the bigger questions about who benefited from empire, who did, and that kind of thing, which I think is remarkable. That it could very easily be a very angry book, or a big book about, as you say, what empire did to the rest of the world as opposed to Britain. Just coming back to something you mentioned a minute ago about 2020. So you were obviously writing the book in 2020, and then all these events happened. In the book, you talk about your experiences with through journalism, meeting the families of doctors who died of COVID, and then Black Lives Matter happened in the early part of the year. How much did 2020 influence the book? Did you find yourself changing course? Did you find yourself going back to stuff you'd already written and saying, well, there's a slightly different lens on this now?
I added a few things, and I thought hard about doing a chapter on statues because that was the focus. But then I decided, I kind of wrote it and then I deleted it because you know what, statues don't matter. The statues are interesting for the debate they've inspired, and we've learned more from that debate as a country than we ever have, I think, about colonialism. But in themselves, statues don't matter in the sense that they're street furniture. It doesn't matter to me whether you keep them or not. It's just so much more important is, racism and multiculturalism, and the fact that our politics is dysfunctional because of imperialism and all the money that came from imperialism that arguably made us rich, So I thought it'd be silly to add a chapter about statues at the end. It read as pretty minor compared to all the other big things I'd already addressed. So in the end, I didn't really change much of the book. It's the only time in my life I've ever written anything timely, and it's weird. It's quite weird. It felt odd to, suddenly be talked about as an anticipated book. I much prefer being, obscure and then a book slowly finding its audience. But I could tell every time I tweeted about it, people kind of went mad about it. And I could sense that there's a lot of appetite.
Do you think that's something to do with our current politics as well? There's a lot in the book about current politicians who reflect imperial ways of speaking or imperial kind of messaging in the tenor of what they say. I don't know if it's just me, but far more so than over maybe the past 15 or so years. At least it wasn't as obvious. Maybe I just didn't notice it, but maybe you did. Do you think that's why it became so anticipated?
No, I didn't notice it either, to be honest. I think two things happening. One, young people are very animated by Black Lives Matter and the associated question of whether imperialism caused systemic racism, right? And museums, they feel the same way about museums that our generation felt about zoos, right? But at the same time, there's a massive backlash from a right-wing sect of the Conservative Party who realized they can weaponize the subject. They can sow division around empire, statues, woke people, decolonization. These are things the public don't really understand. But if they attack it, it works really well for them in focus groups. It's a very simple thing for them to do. It's easy. And it's the equivalent of putting Union Jacks on your Zoom screen, you know what I mean? Well, it's the equivalent of attacking the European Union. They can't do that anymore. So they need a new enemy. And that enemy is basically left-wing woke people like you and I, who are wanging on about decolonization, right? And it's going really well for them. But you're right, it's in the news every single day now. It's crazy, isn't it?
I just found it remarkable. As I was reading the book, obviously you tweet about these things anyway, and you use the hashtag Empireland on certain articles that have been coming out, but it just feels almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, that there's this book about empire that's come out that's starting to try and urge people to re-educate themselves about it, or just educate themselves about it in a slightly different way than we have been as Brits. Meanwhile, this kind of culture war that's going on is obsessing over these things, whether it's statues or Britain's role in the world. And the thing that really resonated with me towards the end of the book is the idea of British exceptionalism, which is kind of really echoed in a lot of the statements at the moment around COVID, of world beating this, world leading that. And then you talk about that a bit as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I counted the number of times our politicians said we were world beating during the early stages of the COVID outbreak. And it was something I found like 56 examples. And it's not just the Conservative Party, it's actually Keir Starmer also talking about world beating, because to win an election, you need to show you're patriotic. And that's what the Labour Party are doing, right? There's a view that to be proud to be British, you need to be proud of imperial history. And it's a really dangerous, dysfunctional idea, because we're talking about 500 years of history here, right? What does it mean to say, I'm proud of British history, which I get every day on Twitter? I mean, what are you proud of? Are you proud of slavery? Are you proud of abolition? Are you proud of Sadiq Khan? Are you proud of mass immigration? It's nonsense. It's like saying I'm proud of biology or proud of jelly. It's just that means nothing. But it's a very common idea, and politicians say it too. Don't try to delete history. We must protect British history. History is not a fixed thing. You know what I mean? It's facts and argument.
Yeah.
So I feel really sorry for the historians out there, man, because they feel like they're being gaslit, because the level of the public debate is so bad. Imagine being an expert in this stuff and like watching the debate. I think people are struggling to even make sense of what's happening. I don't even think the politicians realize what they're doing. I think it's like something that comes naturally to them, but they haven't thought it through.
Yeah, I found it was interesting when the book does start to talk about different countries' approaches to their own history, and how the British, we're not great at kind of digging in deep to it in the way that, say, Germany is, where we're like coming to terms with things, really kind of critiquing our own role, while also, accepting that's done. And there was, I can't remember what the quote was, but it was something about Germany sees the study of history about the future.
Oh yeah, this is Neil McGregor, the former chair of the British Museum, who said something along the lines of, Germans look at their history to understand themselves. The British look at their history for comfort.
Yeah. And does that kind of factor into this kind of collective social amnesia about imperialism? We kind of erase the atrocities while we celebrate the things like the abolition of slavery. We're not very good at saying there were some terrible things that happened here alongside some things that kind of advanced the world a little bit. And is that a particularly like British disease? Are we the only people that do that? Do other countries do that?
I think other countries do it. And actually, that's a very important point. There was a survey done 2 weeks ago by Ipsos Mori, which found that it questioned people across Europe how much they wanted their empire to return. And Belgians, the Dutch, the French, they all were, they were all quite nostalgic about their empire. But the British were the most nostalgic. I think something like 28% of Brits wanted a return of British Empire. And I think you need amnesia for nostalgia to happen, because if you remembered it, you wouldn't be nostalgic, But there's so many examples of the amnesia in our country. It's insane. We forget the main reason why we have multiculturalism. The main reason I'm here is because we had a multicultural empire, and empire made us citizens of Britain. Literally, the 1948 Nationality Act made us citizens. Sorry, my parents. And so we forget that. We forget that Winston Churchill, obviously, great war leader, also a massive imperialist, and some people say white supremacist. We forget the imperial contribution to both world wars. We see ourselves primarily as a country that won World War II, right? But we forget the allies who were involved in America. But we also forget that, millions of imperial troops were involved. And I think back to the 50 remembrance services I must have sat through in my life, and not one has ever mentioned that the Sikhs were there, or the Jamaicans were there, and the Australians. It's just not mentioned. And even at school, when we were a really diverse student body, it didn't occur to anyone to go, oh, by the way, you guys were there.
Yeah.
It would have made a big difference.
Yeah, and that kind of seeps through as well, doesn't it? You reference that, idiot Lawrence Fox and his Twitter thing about the Sikhs, and it just seeps through. People just kind of take it as read, because that's kind of the education about imperialism and empire has been under strength, or in fact non-existent, for decades now.
Yeah, Lawrence Fox thing really gets on my. It's really disgusting what happened, because basically he had a violent racist reaction to the appearance of a Sikh in the film 1917, then became famous on the back of it. You know what I mean? It's like ridiculous. Not only did the Sikhs fight for a country that colonized them and murdered them sometimes at Jallianwala Bagh, then their contribution was deleted to such a degree that someone like Lauren Fox can become famous because the sight of us offends him in a movie, you know? It's disgusting, you know, but it's very common.
Yeah. On the kind of social media aspect of things, you've been really open on social media about the reaction to the book, and you've retweeted and quoted things where people have had negative reactions or kind of slightly dim-witted reactions to it. Is that because people find it so hard to critically evaluate Empire, or are people just being defensive because that's the product of our times and it's social media and it's really easy to be overly defensive about something without thinking about it, and people don't want to admit ignorance? They don't want to say that it's hard to discuss this, so they don't, and that's why it's a polarized debate.
Actually, I'm writing up something for Radio 4 about this. Like, why has it been so crazy? And I just think there's various reasons. One is that there's the view that Britain is always good, has always been good. You know, that you need to love British history to love Britain. So when you say something negative, it really affects people's sense of patriotism, right? Then there's the view that Britain is incapable of being racist, you know, because we won World War II, beat the evil racist Germans, and did abolition. So when you point out the fact that we were white supremacist and sometimes genocidal in the 19th century, it really annoys people. But also, I think when you're talking about empire, you're talking about race. You're talking about white people conquering and enslaving brown people. And when you have a brown person like me, or more importantly, David Olusoga, finally changing the narrative, you know, from the colonized point of view to the colonized slightly, people go mad. It becomes a race war immediately, you know. And that's what I found myself in the middle of, this insane race war. Oh, and the problem is that the conversation doesn't involve very many facts or argument. It becomes very quickly about feelings, you know. It's about whether empire makes you feel proud or ashamed. And the moment you're throwing feelings around, it's impossible. The conversation is out of control, you know. So I think that's why it's toxic, basically. And that's why I get death threats, and it's been mad.
And then on the other side of it, it's become a bestseller. So there's obviously a lot of people that really want to learn about it. And I said before we started that people probably a bit like me come to this thing thinking I might know a little bit about this through family history or things you've picked up, and then you realize the kind of unbelievable depth of what you don't know about this and what you've never been told, and things that were obviously the documentary I saw a while back, and that was not necessarily surprised, but the kind of the heft of it was a bit shocking. But there seems to be an appetite to learn about it. So do you see that side of it as well, that people want to educate themselves? They want to get to know this. That's
a very good point. I need to remember that it's mostly been positive. You know, it's very easy when people are being crazy to just focus on that. Actually, it's mostly been people saying, I didn't know about this, or I thought I knew about it, but I've now changed my mind, which is an amazing thing for a writer to have. I mean, I never thought I'd have that. I mean, that's kind of why I wrote it, in that I didn't know about it. And I wrote the book as a way of educating myself. And it's amazing that other people are getting the benefit of my 4 years of pain, because it was hard. And I'm not someone who would normally read a history book, to be honest. It's not my idea of a good fun. And history books focus on facts, and they don't have dialogue, romance. You know, the narrative is all over the place. If you read novels, it can be quite hard work. And every book on British Empire is at least 500 pages long. Normally they're thousands, right? So I think there's a load of people who would never pick up a book about British Empire, right? And I guess Empireland gives them a way into this impossible subject. And that's really satisfying. And yeah, it's great.
I think for me, that was one of the things that made the book so accessible, is that I think it's one of the early chapters, you talk about the research, quite frankly. You talk about the amount of books you have to read in obviously 4 years. So it doesn't feel like reading a history book. I felt like I was kind of learning a bit with you. Obviously, the weight of the experience you've had by researching it and visiting places comes through, but I didn't feel like it was a history book. Was it kind of a conscious decision not to write from the point of view of like a real historian or expert, to write from the point of view of someone who was learning about this as well, and figuring things out as you research? Because it seemed quite honest as well.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely was a decision. I guess it's something I did with my first book, in that was a book about schizophrenia, another subject I would never sit down and read about. But that experience taught me that actually, if you make people care about the narrator, then you can make them interested in really difficult things, right? So schizophrenia was one thing, and Empire, I think, is a very similar subject in that it's complicated, scary subject, but actually there's a way of talking about it. What I longed for most when I was researching it was for Bill Bryson to write a book about British Empire, because I love Bill Bryson. I think he's actually incredibly clever and incredibly knowledgeable, but because he has such an accessible style, he doesn't get the credit he deserves. Although I think he gets credit for maybe his science book, which takes very complicated things and explains them accessibly and in an entertaining way. So that was what I was aiming for, although it's difficult because there's not that much humor in British Empire, whereas there's probably more humor in science, and the scientists. But in British Empire, you've got to face up to the fact there's rape, looting, murder, and massacres. You can't be funny about those things. So there's some bits where you've just got to be very serious and depressed about it all.
But I think, yeah, even doing that, your personality as a writer kind of comes through. There's obviously the mention of Pizza Express in there at one point. As
Yes.
you'd expect. Which, I wouldn't say it kind of lightens it at all, but it's interesting. I think the Bill Bryson point really stands up. I hadn't thought about that as I was reading it, but last year I read the Body book about the Bill Bryson did, and again it was kind of, the chapters were kind of regimented, and you knew what you were going to learn, and you were learning as like with him as you were going along. So it did feel kind of like you're having your hand held through this difficult, nuanced subject. So I did kind of, as a reader, I really appreciated that, because it didn't feel like history. It didn't feel like obviously it's not 500 pages, but it didn't feel like that kind of dense 500-page volume. Like my brother reads that kind of thing, and I just can't.
No, I think you have to have a certain kind of brain. And to be honest, let's face it, it's men. It's men who read those books. So I'm glad that some women are reading Empireland.
Is that kind of why you thought about one day, or in the past, writing it as a novel? Because that's the way you find your way into subjects like this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that we have very little knowledge as a country of empire is that we avoid it as a subject in novels and films. Films are incredible. I mean, the only depictions you get of empire are of nostalgic Raj in the late 19th century, maybe early 20th century. You don't get any depictions of the 400 years beforehand, when empire was so different. I can only think of Gandhi and Zulu, as two mainstream films about empire. And both of them, what you could say, aren't sufficient or aren't particularly accurate about what happened. So, and I think novels also ignore that part of history too. I mean, there's what's his name, J.G. Farrell, The Siege of Krishnapur.
Yeah.
But apart from that, there are hardly any books about empire, earlier colonialism. So, yeah, I mean, it is a kind of rich area for novelists to look at.
Do you think you will, or do you feel like now you've written this, it's something you'll leave behind, or do you think it's going to carry on in your writing?
I don't know, to be honest. I realize each one of my books has been totally different. And I think that's not the way to have a successful career. The way you have a successful career is you do one thing and you do it really well. Keep doing the same thing. So Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, you know what I mean? And I've done a memoir, a novel, and now a popular history book. And it's like, what the hell, you know what I mean? And but I like fresh challenges. You know what I mean? Life is short. So I like the fact that I've written a novel and this. I don't like repeating myself, so I don't know if I will. It'd be very easy to. My publisher wants me to write a version of the same book again, which I don't want to do.
Because that's how it works, isn't it? If you do one thing that's successful in the publishing industry, you're just there. There'll be another one.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way publishing works, and then there's loads of imitations as well. But as far as this subject goes, I don't mind if it's imitated, because my mission is to just encourage the education and encourage people to read about it. So knock yourselves out.
Is that kind of sort of an end game of the book? Is it's about education, because it's getting towards the final chapters. There's no great thing where you kind of stamp your mark and say Empire was this, that, and the other, and it did this, that, and the other. You present a lot of facts and you present a lot of interpretation of that, and some of it you don't have to make your mind up about, like some of the atrocities. There's no interpretation to be given there, but you present it. So was it education that is the goal of this, to get this taught in schools, to get people talking about this?
Yeah, it was the goal. That was my goal with the first book as well, was to get sane conversation about one of the most difficult mental health conditions there is. You know, people don't talk about schizophrenia. People are scared by it. People are scared by people who have the symptoms across the road. So to get people to actually look at it is quite a challenge. And it's the same with this, in that in our lifetimes, there's not been a sane kind of compromise between the two factions for it to be taught in a meaningful way. It is taught a bit. I think the Key Stage 3, there's a bit of teaching of it, but it's not meaningful. And it should be the most important thing kids get told about British history, and it's not. So,
Yeah.
and you know what? There's loads of campaigns at the moment, loads, not only just in education, but also in decolonizing museums. And it's a good area on which to kind of join the conversation.
My as I was reading, I sent a message to my sister who works in the museum sector, and saying, "Oh, we should read this book. It's got a really interesting thing about the museums in there." She said, "Yeah, it's a big topic at the moment. They're struggling to come to terms with it as well, because you know, for them it's one of those things where there's potentially a will to do something and then a commercial impact of it as well. So how do they? It's the other thing they've got to justify with themselves. Whereas,
yeah, museums is one place where the conversation has been current, and they do actually have it. And I was amazed to be invited by the V&A to talk to them last week, because I slagged them off quite a lot, and that shows you the willingness in the sector to talk. You know, they recognise they've got a problem.
yeah, in terms of education, what needs to happen to get it onto a syllabus? I know you mentioned edXL. It's got the most popular one. There's a really, really low percentage of people that learn about it in any meaningful way. What has to happen to change that? Does it have to be political change, generational change? Is there something you've got in mind that you think would help?
I think the generational change is happening, and you can tell, because you know the national curriculum doesn't have to be followed by academies and private schools. And I've heard from so many teachers who are already teaching it, and that's because there's demand. I think kids now get their knowledge of colonialism from so many different sources, on Instagram, you know, from the web, on general YouTube and so on. There's amazing stuff out there that we never had when we were growing up. This amazing Brown History Instagram account, which taught me more about colonialism than I ever got taught at school. So I think that change is happening anyway. And I think there's good models for what can be done internationally. I think New Zealand has totally changed its curriculum recently, and it's got a very similar issue with colonialism, you know, and it's a very toxic debate. So yeah, I mean, ideally a party will come in that wants to teach it in a balanced way. The problem is neither Labour or the Conservative Party have shown any sign of wanting to change things. So we had Jamie Corbyn saying he wanted to introduce the teaching of empire, but he wanted to teach the crimes of empire, you know, which I find as problematic as Michael Gove's idea that we should teach all the good things. You know, doesn't seem to be anything in the middle, which is really difficult. And then you've got the additional problem that in general, history is declining as a subject. You know, people don't want to study history. So
that potentially comes back to something we were talking about earlier, about the kind of the British problem with history, our kind of struggle to understand it in certain ways, or to look back on it in kind of strange ways. I was thinking as I was reading, when was I educated on something like this? And I think it must have been at university. In my first or second year, we studied slave narratives. And that was the first time formal education had addressed anything like this. I remember, you know, not necessarily shocking, because I knew these things had happened, but it was the first time I'd been invited to learn about it, or to really go in depth on that kind of subject.
That's still better than me. I mean, really? I got to study Hanif Qureshi in my final term at university.
Really?
That was it. No one taught us that Enoch Powell was a local MP. No one taught us that he wanted to be Viceroy of India. And that's why he had such screwed up attitudes about multiculturalism. You know, no one told us that. It would have made another big difference.
Speaking of, I mean, I was going to mention Enoch Powell, because anyone who's read your novel will know he's got the kind of epigram in your novel, hasn't he?
Yeah.
And he kind of almost looms over the book in certain ways. He comes up every few chapters. There's something that he's done or he said, or something that some echo of him in today's politics as well. How did your personal history of growing up in Wolverhampton and the life you lived there and the kind of legacy of Powell impact the writing of the book as well?
Yeah, but Powell kind of follows me around like a bad smell, like in each one of my books. I never met the guy. I met the guy who took over, who was just as bad as him, really. Who came to school. Again, no one explained that he was a massive racist. He just came and gave us our school prizes. But yeah, when I look back at Wolverhampton, post-war Wolverhampton, and what the situation my parents faced, it was very imperial. The only way you could explain it is by understanding colonialism. I mean, there was racial violence. I mean, so-called Paki bashing, Wagga bashing was like a sport, in the Midlands, well, probably around the country. And that echoed what was happening in Empire. There was the racial generalizations. I mean, a lot of politicians spoke in massive racial generalizations, which all went back to Empire. The idea the Sikhs were martial, or, black people were lazy. All those generalizations went back to Empire. There was the discrimination. I mean, Sikhs weren't allowed to do the best jobs on the Indian railways, for example. And, the white people kept the best jobs for themselves in India. The same thing happened in Wolverhampton in that, I think, there's endless cases about Asian men not being allowed to work on the buses. I think the entire West Midlands police force didn't have a single police officer of color until 1982, so, and then there was the color bar socially in that, there was generally brown pubs and white pubs. I think working men's clubs had a color bar in Wolverhampton until 1983, even now there's certain pubs, I'd say, in the Midlands you'd go to if you're brown, and certain pubs you definitely won't. And that goes back to Empire, when brown and white people socialized separately. They lived separately, and that happened too, in that brown people weren't allowed to have council homes in parts of Wolverhampton. They weren't allowed to buy certain houses because of their color. And that all goes back to Empire. So I've become that guy who just sees Empire everywhere.
That was when parts of the book really started cutting through as well. To me, it was when you're writing about some of the things that racists in society complain about not lack of integration, are the things that were denied to people through an imperial legacy.
Yeah.
I found that really, that's when it started to really hammer home the legacy of imperialism as well, not just the history of it, not just the kind of what happened, but how it's kind of left its mark as generations have changed and Britain's matured.
And one of the things that really got me was the whole thing about the fear of mixed interracial relationships. If you look at there was race riots as early, I think, as 1919 in the UK. If you look at all the early race riots, they were often white people attacking black people, for one thing. So they weren't really race riots; they were kind of racial attacks. A lot of them started when a black man or a brown man was seen with a white woman, and similarly, a lot of racial violence in India, happened because of that fear of white women being invaded by the brown man. It was a big part of the mutiny, the reaction against the mutiny, the stories of white women being raped, lots of them made up, some of them not, which drove the British mad. And similarly, at Jallianwala Bagh, the reason General Dyer went so crazy, one of the reasons is that a white missionary was supposedly attacked, and he made every Indian on that street where she was attacked walk on his hands and knees home, for weeks. So, yeah, I think that kind of fear of miscegnation? I never know how to say that word. Runs deep in Empire and in modern Britain.
I think quite rightly when you refer to it as like a stain that runs through some of these things. And does that partially explain why a lot of people are so reluctant to talk about it or reluctant to engage with it and find it so difficult to engage with it? Because it is, shameful in a way. I think there was a certain chapter where you talked about the apologies that Tony Blair gave for some other historic atrocities, but
Ireland,
coming to terms with that negative role that Britain has had on the world, some of the things that are unequivocally awful.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we don't remember is really bloody painful. And I feel that myself because I am British. I didn't enjoy learning that my country had done this crap. You know what I mean? It's not fun. But I think it helps to understand your country if you reflect on it. But I think also we forget it because it's really complicated. It's 500 years of history. It's much easier to remember yourselves as a country that won World War II, 6-year narrative, clear beginning, clear end, clear morality, and also we're the good guys. And also I think there's the fact that we've never been invaded in the modern age. So like France had to face up to what it did in World War II, because they were invaded. And lots of other countries have had to deal with their difficult histories. But empire's always been abroad. So we've never had a moment of reckoning. We've never had to face up to it. I mean, you could argue that even when empire was at its height, the public knowledge of empire was quite low, And so we've always been slightly dissociated from what's going on over there.
Do you think the public knowledge was low because just people just saw it as that's how it was, or because one of the fascinating things is so few people kind of worked like in maintaining the empire? I can't remember the numbers, but it was X million of people controlled by X thousand of civil servants, essentially, and they were all overseas.
Yeah. I think it was Robert Toombs who says that the empire in India was run by the same size office as the Northern Ireland office.
Yeah.
And it's like nearly 500 million people. Yeah, I mean, that was another reason why I think we've never really faced up to it. But also, you've got to remember, a lot of the evidence was purposely destroyed as well. I think it's called Operation Legacy, where Britain went out of its way to destroy the evidence of what it did and what happened during empire. And you see it also in what happened with the houses that were bought from slavery money, in that the owners went out of their way to, when slavery became unacceptable, to conceal where their wealth came from. Also the people who got their money from India as well.
And you kind of see almost the legacy of that now with some of the stuff that's happening, like the National Trust, which comes up in the book a few times, about how there's now differing asks being put on the National Trust to either be very open and honest and present their history in ways that certainly as a National Trust member I've rarely seen in many of the houses I've been to, and other people who are almost kind of holding a sword over them, saying, don't be honest about this.
Yeah, no, I think, again, I don't think the public realize what's happening there. So you've got the National Trust, I think, whose mission is to highlight history, commissioning academic research into the colonial history of lots of his houses, doing perfectly sensible academic research, in my opinion. And then you got a backlash from people saying, oh, I don't want wokeness when I go to the National Trust. I want to just enjoy my scones. And not only that, you've got the Charity Commission, which is run by a woman who is literally a Tory politician. She ran to be an MP, was a Tory peer, claims to be independent now, but is running, basically launched a culture war against the National Trust and is threatening to investigate them for veering away from their purpose from revealing history. So basically what you have there is, I think, one step away from book burning, because if Black Lives Matter were doing that, they'd call it cancel culture, because what they're doing is they want the National Trust to stop publishing academic research. I do think it's one step away from book burning, and we should all be really angry about it.
Also, I just think, the National Trust is very accessible to lots of people, and it's where people go for days out. If you want to start a more popular education around Britain and its past, that's a really great way to do it, and a really accessible way for lots of different people to kind of learn about these things. Just before I hand over to a couple of questions we've had come in, if anyone does have any more questions, do pop them on the Q&A bit. Are you positive about change, that you do think people, you've said that there's generational stuff where people are getting more of an appetite to learn this. Do you sense in, say, 5-10 years now, it might be more widely spoken of in classrooms? People might be writing essays about this when they're 11 years old. They might be starting to learn more.
Yeah, I think I ended the book quite positively. And since publication, I've gone through massive mood swings about it. Because sometimes sometimes Boris will make a video saying, Black history is British history. I'm like, great. Oh my God, he finally gets it. And the next minute, he's writing a column about why Churchill's statue needs to be protected. When Churchill's statue is not under any threat. No one's going to tear down Churchill's bloody statue. He just knows he's going to play well. And so that depresses me. The situation with the National Trust is really depressing. And every week there's something in the Sunday Telegraph about this. It's just ongoing culture war. They keep they keep playing, and that makes me feel quite bleak. But ultimately, I think it will end well because young people feel so strongly about it, and there's such demand, for education. And I know teachers are doing it anyway. So in a way, the national curriculum is neither here nor there. I think teachers will teach it. So that fills me with hope.
Very good. I'm just going to switch to a couple of questions from the watching on audience. One from Mike, who's loving the book, which has certainly opened my eyes. His question is, how often did your parents regret joining your grandparents in the Midlands, or if they regretted it?
Actually, no, they never did. They loved. It was definitely the best thing to do. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you won't find many Sikhs complaining about British Empire, in that they benefited from it. And certainly, I mean, my parents, like many immigrants, kept their suitcases on the wardrobes and were reluctant to take British passports because there was always a feeling they might get sent back. But that's not the same as them wanting to go, And I think we've had really good lives here. I just think the more we understand imperial history, the more we realize that there's a reason we're here that goes back centuries, and we're entitled to be here.
One from Rosie. Have you considered trying to engage Eton and other public schools on the need to change syllabus and teach a more fact-based account of empire?
Eton.
Yeah,
and
other public schools. So.
Yeah, Eton. Eton comes up a lot in the book, doesn't it? I mean, you've got Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, both Etonians, right? And both just happen to be two of the most imperially nostalgic politicians we have, right? I mean, Boris, when he's not writing books on Churchill, he's talking about flag-waving Pekingese, or he's reading out Rudyard Kipling in Burma, He oozes out of every pore. And then you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's writing books about the Victorians, really bad books about how great the imperial Victorians were. And they both just happen to be leading this Brexit project. And they both just happen to have gone to Eton. And it turns out they both just happen to have been taught Jan Morris, who actually I think is a very good imperial historian, but is very nostalgic for empire. So I think the main thing they could do is to expand their curriculum beyond Jan Morris. I don't think they even teach the whole of Jan Morris. According to James Wood, they just teach excerpts. So actually, if you read the whole of Jan Morris, I don't think you'd be left with any sense that, empire was only good. She talks about the massacres quite plainly and the rottenness of empire. So the problem is selective history, So I think if they expand their curriculums, that'd be good. There's actually quite a few private schools doing really good work with decolonizing the curriculum. Again, probably because there's demand.
And there was another part to Rosie's question of, is there a hope that younger people will be more probing and informed about empire, given their access to social media?
Yeah, I mean, one of the downside of having access to social media, you get fake news, and there's such a thing as fake history. And there are, I mean, I confront this in the book, there are definite exaggerations in this debate. So you get the quite common statement that, a lot of our wealth comes from empire. I don't think you can really say that, economically. Some of it really does, and you can prove it, you can point to it. But I think by exaggerating things, you undermine the case. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question. I forgot it halfway through my answer.
It was the hope of young people being more questioning because of social media.
Yeah, you need kind of places they can go for the facts as well as their passion, and hopefully my book's just one of many. I'm
going to read a question here. It's on my phone, so I'm not just like checking Twitter or something like that. Someone has emailed it. So this is from Helen. Empireland is very measured, very patient in your assessment of imperialism and its consequences. Has the reaction to the book inclined you to be less tolerant of our dumb arrogance and willful ignorance as a nation?
It's made me really reflect. And I've had racism throughout my career, like online, but this is a whole new level. Like when I went on Nihal's show on Radio 5 to talk about it, I had like 5 days of, both of us did, of constant racism. So much so I couldn't say anything without having someone say, get back to where you came from. So I just stopped using Twitter for a while. But I can't work out whether that's just what you get when you're a person of color with some profile, because footballers get it, don't they?
Mm.
Nihal gets it every day of his life. And so I wonder whether it's that, but it's also because book publishing is much nicer than Fleet Street. A lot of people in Penguin have been asking if I'm okay, which paradoxically, no one's ever done before, but paradoxically makes me feel more upset. I don't know why. I think it makes me realize that it's unacceptable. You know what I mean? The moment someone asks you if you're okay, you're like, oh God, maybe I'm not okay. I am okay, but it's screwed up, isn't it? It's not acceptable that social media companies let this happen to black footballers every day of their lives, and they make money out of it. So, and they're always anonymous accounts. So I think it's easy to solve, really.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm a football fan, and every time one of these things comes up, you feel like hopefully you're approaching more of a tipping point where something is done. But then a couple of weeks pass, nothing happens. There seems to be no intent from Twitter other than to say they, condemn in the strongest words what people have said. It doesn't really feel like there is genuine appetite to change it at all.
No, but I do feel there's momentum, and I think ultimately something's going to happen. And yeah, it's messed up being in the middle of it. I can't tell you, it's like crazy.
I can imagine. So this is a big question.
Big in length?
Big in length and in topic, I think.
Right.
Both. It's from Helen again. You talk about well, it gets gets close to it. You talk about imperial psychological legacies in empire's state of mind. You quote Orwell: "Every white man's life was one long struggle not to be laughed at." So, if imperialism and racism are responsible for the inherited trauma among the descendants of empire, as well as the loss of our raison d'etre, was empire the foundation of our mental health crisis of today?
Wow.
Big question. That is a big question.
I think there's a big difference between talking about the psychology of a nation, because we don't actually have, we're not one person, there's not one brain, and individual psychology. I interviewed David Harewood the other day, and he was interested. He was talking about this. There was an academic he was talking about who has done work showing that people who are subjected to constant racism actually suffer health-wise. Their physical health suffers, which is why, black men arguably have a higher rate of psychiatric illness, and I think brown men in general. So I do think there's a connection, arguably, between, the racism caused by empire and mental health, but it's indirect in that sense, But when I talk about the psychology of Britain, it's probably metaphorical, isn't it? Because we're not one thing, we're a million different things. But another mental health analogy I do like is the one of therapy, because people are like, oh, why are you pointing out the bad things about empire? But it's like, sorry, about British history. And it's like, just because you know the bad things, it doesn't mean you hate your country. Like therapy, like you might do therapy like I have done for a few years, and you might discover some bad things about yourself. You might discover some bad things about your partner, but do you love them any less? Hopefully, it just means you understand them more. It might even make you love them more because you see what they've been through and what they've overcome. And I feel the same about British history, in that finding out these terrible things hasn't made me hate the country. It's made me understand it and love it probably even more.
And you do actually put that in the book, don't you? There's a footnote, I think, where because of the question you've had so many times of, if you don't like it here, then all the rest of it. So you actually point out these are the things I love about Britain. It's like a long list of stuff. So
that was one of the many arguments I had with my editor, who wanted me to delete it. But I'm so glad I kept it, because that footnote, because the number one thing when any brown person criticizes anything about Britain is, be more grateful, you'd have a crap life in India, Africa, Jamaica, and the point is, we're British and we wouldn't be in Jamaica or India, and we're entitled to criticize our country because we love it as much as our white colleagues. If you're going to say that to me, say it to everyone else on the Times. But because there's fewer of us, it's a really common thing. This is actually a kind of argument I had with Matthew Paris, who said something along similar lines last year, I think. And I did a short essay about it for Radio 4, and he actually changed his mind, and that was great.
Very difficult to change someone's mind these days, isn't it?
Yeah, especially when you're in your 70s. But I think it shows you how much Matthew is a thinker, that he did. And actually, I'm getting quite a lot of letters from people in their 70s and 80s who are saying, as well as the ones that want to kill me, saying, you know, I thought I knew what to think about empire, but you've changed my mind. It's never too late to learn, is it?
No, that's great.
Mm.
Question from VT. Besides the obvious, what did you learn when writing this book that you felt most optimistic about in terms of how fast society is changing?
Right. There's a lot to feel depressed about. What did I feel most optimistic about? Probably watching a film like Black Panther, you know, and it's the 9th most popular film of all time. Did you know that? I'd never watched it.
I've not watched it, but I saw a stat that it was kind of up there.
Yeah.
It's probably on.
And
I've listened to the film review shows on 5 Live, so it's probably on there.
yeah, so it's a massive film, and it's hugely, you know, popular amongst young people, but also engaged massively in really deep colonial issues. There's a scene in the set in a British museum where one of the heroes basically goes to the curator and says, you know, can I have that stuff back? You nicked from Africa. And she's like, no. And he's like, why not? I'm gonna nick it back like you nicked it. And that fills me with hope that they are so much further ahead than our obsession with the thingy marbles. I forget what the Pantheon marbles, what they're called.
Elgin marbles.
Elgin bloody marbles, you know. That's the kind of tedious way our generation has talked about this stuff. But they're much more proactive. And also the other thing that fills me hope is all the campaigns that are out there. There's so many online campaigns, especially when it comes to museums, you know, and they're doing really great work.
Again, it's one of those things that does feel like it's potentially approaching some meaningful action. So there's the talking, and maybe over the next, 5 years, we might see some. It'll be a kind of a showpiece thing, won't it? When something gets
totally, it's happening already. I mean, look at someone like Alice Proctor, who has been campaigning, doing these tours of the British Museum and the V&A and other places, pointing out the artifacts that people want repatriated and why it means a lot to certain countries. Her tours, I think they're called uncomfortable art tours. I went on one for the book, have totally changed the way the British Museum label things. You know, they've actually started doing their similar uncomfortable art tours. And just goes to show you, one person has already had a big impact, and that's happening in all sorts of spheres.
Going back to culture and heritage, we covered this a little bit, but just good to pose the question from Alice. What are your thoughts on Culture Secretary Oliver Dalden's letter to national museums and cultural bodies on contested heritage?
Yeah, I mean, Oliver Dowden is the culture minister, but it should be called the cultural warrior in chief, because he is at the heart of a lot of these silly things. He's written a letter to the heritage bodies saying, if you engage with woke people on these anti-colonial campaigns, we're going to withdraw your funding. Quite threatening. He had a meeting last week with all the heritage bodies making that point. Apparently, the heritage body said, well, you're legally not allowed to because we're independent. The problem is they're all suffering from massive budget problems because of COVID. And so this is a real threat. They need money from the government to keep alive. And if you've got the culture minister saying this stuff and also complaining about the National Trust and woke historians deleting history, you know, you've got a real problem. I mean, I get the feeling that he's just a man who doesn't read books, which is a problem when you're the culture secretary, right? I've thought about sending him a copy, but I don't know if it's worth the bother.
So yeah, him who doesn't read books and Gavin Williamson who often doesn't seem like he's been to school.
The strange thing happened to me. I got a DM on Twitter from a minister who has been involved in this culture war stuff.
Oh, really?
I can't give you the name. And he said, I'm reading your book. And I was like, that's what I mean, that I don't think they know what they're doing. You know, at the same time as wanting to read my book, they're writing columns saying, we're going to introduce a law, you know, protecting slavery statues. You know, I mean, it's weird.
Yeah, another mind to change. The last question we've got here from Roshni is, does the backlash you receive from the book make you hopeful that our society can actually change and start accepting our history?
It makes me depressed, but also it fills me with hope that we're actually having the conversation. There's a line that became famous last year, which went along the lines of, when you, how's it go? It goes, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? I think something similar is happening with imperial history. When you're used to your narrative being told by middle-aged white men, having someone else tell the story, having brown people tell the story can feel very challenging. So I think a lot of people feel threatened by David Olusoga and me, that brown people are finally taking the narrative. I would say to them, there's nothing to fear. All that's happening is that we're adding to the arguments and the facts. We're not deleting stuff. We're not. Decolonization is a really troubling phrase because it creates the impression of things being taken off. But actually, it's about expanding the curriculum. It's about putting things in context. The fact that I wasn't taught anything about colonialism is a failure of education. But if I've been taught some of this stuff, it would have made it better. And I think we need to find different words so that people aren't triggered so badly.
And that feels like a decent place to kind of bring this to a close. I think, for me personally, the book is educational, fascinating, enlightening. I got a lot from reading it. So
thanks, man. I appreciate your support.
And thank you, Sathnam, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for sending in so many nice questions as well. I'll hand back to Ben for a minute.
Wow, thank you. What a fascinating hour this has been. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Sathnam, you're absolutely amazing. I absolutely adored that. And Jamie, thank you so much for your time. We've got a few things coming up. We're constantly busy. We're at Our Bookshop in Tring. Thursday, Simon Mayo is joining us, and his book is based in a newspaper, which it's a different world. I don't know if you read Simon Mayo's book, but it seems like a different world with busy tube stations and all sorts of stuff. Erica Waller and Sarah Manning, 11th of March. Abigail Dean on 13th of March. Andrew Taylor and Miranda Marlins on the 18th of March. And Jill Mansell and Catherine Elliott, 25th of March, and it's just going on and on. So, guys, thank you all for joining us. Do come again and join any of our other events. And without further ado, thank you. And what I was going to say to you, Sathnam, was how impressive your bibliography is in the book. Honestly, it's clearly an impressively researched book, which is testament to the size of the bibliography. Don't tell me you read every single one of those books.
I think I probably did, actually, but you don't have to. That's the thrill.
That's kind of the point, isn't it? But good. Thank you so much once more, and
Thanks, Ben.
we'll see you next time.
Cheers. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Bye.